Suikoden: The Woven Web of a Century was the last entry in the series that up until now was only available in Japan. Thanks to the endless efforts of the community, it's now fully available for non-Japanese speakers to enjoy, and it's by far one of the best entries in the franchise that's unfortunately stuck on the PSP. The story takes place in a world where terrifying creatures known as the Terrace Farmer attack it once every 100 years. Only the powerful Empire's unifying power appears capable of protecting the population, although some are skeptical of their motives after their prior involvement in a massacre of a town. This is where the player comes in and takes up the fight as the aptly named hero, who's joined by a band of like-minded individuals who seek to turn the tide of the battle and ultimately confront the Empire's evil deeds as well. Much like previous entries in the series, the battles take the form of a turn-based system and allow you to carry out a huge range of attacks and spells that are all tied to each individual character. Along the way, you'll come into contact with a range of people who will eventually join your cause, and this is where the Woven Web of a Century truly excels. Of course, the formation of your party on the battlefield also has its part to play, with you being able to choose which role you would like your characters to occupy. If you don't take this aspect into consideration, it's easy to find yourself at a loss, as strategically placing your fighters is the easiest way to give yourself an advantage. As a huge fan of the series, it was an absolute pleasure to finally be able to play this somewhat forgotten entry in the franchise. So if you've never heard of it, or if you're simply hoping to get some new Suikoden action, then Woven Web of a Century is one game you do not want to miss. When it comes to first-person shooters, the PSP wouldn't exactly be the most ideal choice, but that didn't stop developers from trying to bring the genre to the handheld, regardless of its lack of a second analog stick. Coded Arms Contagion is a sequel to the first game, which managed to improve upon nearly every aspect it introduced, with its fast-paced gameplay and surprisingly intuitive control scheme that makes it one of the best first-person shooters on the console. What stood out to me the most is the premise that sees you entering a computer system and fighting viruses who take the form of the enemy. It's your job to search the system in the hopes of locating your stranded teammates, and it's nothing that's going to win any awards, but it's definitely one of the more creative stories you'll find in a game of this kind. On the gameplay front, this is where Contagion excels, and provides the player with a slew of weaponry to help them come out on top. From shotguns to machine guns and more exotic offerings like railguns and futuristic grenades, you've got plenty of choices at your fingertips. To complement this aspect of the gameplay, there's a pretty robust upgrading system that sees you collecting currency throughout each level, and then being able to upgrade each weapon to your liking. This sense of progression really adds to the overall experience, and allows you to tailor your arsenal to your specific style of play. When it comes down to it, Contagion is by no means perfect, but it clearly accomplished what it set out to do, and that was to provide an enjoyable FPS on the go that's easy to jump into and play in short bursts. So if you fancy taking on a new shooter on the PSP, Coded Arms Contagion is definitely a great option. Wild Arms first hit the scene way back in 1996 on the PlayStation and managed to stand out amongst its contemporaries by providing a unique take on the somewhat cliché RPG setup that many have come to know and love. Instead of taking place in the usual fantasy world, it would instead see you making your way through an adventure that drawed upon the Wild West as its main inspiration. Taking place on a dying planet, the story sees you taking up the fighters Clarissa and Felis as they try to track down a notorious drifter known as Rupert, who stole a magical sword, which is said to have the power to return the world to its original beauty. As with many RPGs of this nature, you'll find yourself visiting a range of locations that all bring their unique flavor to the journey, as well as meet many interesting characters that help flesh out the world and the events that transpire. The script is without a doubt one of the game's crowning achievements, and really breathes life into the various people that occupy the world by providing a nice amount of personality and humor. Thankfully, the gameplay is just as impressive, and as with many tactical RPGs, the battles all play out on a grid, with the player taking control of several units as they clash with enemy forces. You've got the usual basic attacks and magic spells to carry out. You've also got the ability to take advantage of the game's unique hex-based grid system by surrounding the enemy on all sides so that you can perform formation arts instead of just a regular attack. These arts offer one of the best ways to deal with troublesome enemies and have the potential to turn the tide in the blink of an eye. If you're you're a fan of one of the many other SRPGs on the PSP, like the Skyer or Final Fantasy Tactics, Wild Arms XF manages to hold its own when put up against them. With its charming story and engaging gameplay, it's definitely a game that's worth checking out. First appearing on the PlayStation 2, Jak and Daxter soon became one of the most prominent games on the system, which no doubt prompted a spin-off that saw Daxter jumping into the driver's seat in an adventure he could call his own. Developed by Ready at Dawn and somewhat of a technical marvel at the time, it all centered around Daxter trying to save Jak after he's captured at the end of the first game, and sees the gameplay reverting back to its platforming roots. You'll find yourself hopping around various unique levels, ranging from construction sites to jungles and rundown hotels that all bring along their own distinct challenge. Occupying each of them are a range of enemies that will stop at nothing to bring Daxter down, and luckily you've got many ways to keep them at bay. The most prominent is your trusty Fly Swatter that allows you to carry out a series of combos, but over the course of the game you'll also gain access to many different ways to counter the threat each enemy poses. This is where your firearm comes into play, with its type of fire being able to be changed on the fly through the use of various canisters that alter its abilities. The first is a gas gun, which temporarily stuns an enemy, giving you the chance to get a good few whacks in. Further down the line you'll grab a flamethrower, which is pretty self-explanatory, and finally a plasma grenade, which is almost essential when it comes to the many bosses that occupy the game. Like past entries, collectibles are also a huge part of the experience and allow the player to access one of the many different minigames that are included. These take the form of scenes ripped straight out of popular movies like The Matrix and Indiana Jones, which provide a welcome reprieve from the usual platforming and shooting antics the main game offers. So if you can find the game on the cheap, Daxter is well worth adding to your collection. Now, the best way to describe Field Commander would be that it's essentially a realistic take on the popular Advance Wars series and brings along with it a much more visceral take on the popular turn-based strategy setup. The gameplay is incredibly simple and sees all of the action taking place on a grid system where the player gets to move their several units around the map and engage with the opposing forces. There's over 30 different types of units in the game that all bring their own unique abilities and strategies to the table, from the lowly infantry to the powerful and devastating tanks. Choosing which unit to use at the right time soon becomes the order of the day, and the best way to advance throughout the several missions that comprise the main campaign. Mixing the gameplay up beyond the various units that make up your army are the commanding officers themselves. Each of them belong to a division which have their own strengths and weaknesses, so choosing the right division to complement your strategies is vital, and there are so many that there's bound to be one that suits your approach. This isn't the only thing you can use to your advantage though, as there are many different factors that can help you achieve victory, with the main one being the terrain of the battlefield itself. For example, dense forests offer cover from tanks who can't make their way through, and cities bring with them higher amounts of defense for units that are placed within. What makes it different from Advance Wars though is that the terrain itself can actually be targeted and destroyed, which will constantly keep you on your toes and not just let you rely on this aspect of defense, as the playing field is constantly in a state of change. If you're a fan of strategy, then there is plenty here to love, and with a series of other modes to jump into apart from the single player campaign, it's a game that's likely going to last you a while. Wipeout has long been part of the PlayStation DNA, so it was a bit of a no-brainer that an entry in the long-running franchise would eventually find its way to the PSP. After the misstep that was Wipeout Fusion on the PlayStation 2, Pure brought it back to its roots and was a huge step in the right direction for the series as a whole. Set in the distant future, racing has been taken to a whole new level. Anti-gravity is now the norm, with each competition providing a faster, more dangerous and more intense experience than anything that had come before. You jump into a hovercraft and get to take on a generous amount of tracks, but it's not just simply about racing your rivals, as weapons also manage to play a part and produce some of the more hectic moments throughout each race. From simple lasers to bombs and even earthquakes, each race can instantly flip and see you trailing behind the pack if you're not careful and don't plan ahead. Thankfully, there are other items that can help you along the way. For instance, you've got standard speed boosts as well as shields that can help you avert the onslaught of attacks from the other racers on the the track. Now, one aspect of the game which is simply mind-blowing are the beautiful and rich environments. The PSP is without a doubt an amazing piece of hardware, and Wipeout Pure pushes it to its absolute limit by not only featuring colourful and lush environments, but with all the frantic action going on, the game runs at a very consistent and fluid frame rate as well. The only negative I can raise against Fusion has to be the learning curve, which will take some time to get to grips with. Due to the insane speed you'll be travelling, it's quite easy to find yourself bashing into corners, but with enough practice and patience you'll soon be breezing through each track in style. Overall, with a huge collection of unlockables, a great sense of speed and addictive gameplay, Wipeout Pure is one of those games that you're gonna find hard to put down. Gundam Battle Royale is a stunningly addictive action combat game that will no doubt appeal to fans of the show as well as those who are looking for a challenge. Offering more than 130 different mechs, all with multiple weapons, optional equipment, and nigh on infinitely customizable stats, Gundam Battle Royale provides an unprecedented degree of freedom to the player. The gameplay is simple and very intuitive, and mainly revolves around dashing about each map and confronting the enemies that reside there. As I've mentioned, the range of weapons is staggering. From long-range guns to missiles and light swords, you're equipped for any situation that might pop up, and with the fluid controls allowing you to make your way around with ease, it soon becomes a delight to play. Each mobile suit has a lot of different ways to attack, either with one of its main weapons, a secondary weapon or ability, a charged attack, or an impressive special move. Most of the different attacks can be a lot of fun to play with, but unfortunately the melee assaults are rather underwhelming if I'm being honest. As you complete missions, you'll gain experience points that allow you to upgrade your mech and alter its appearance and skills to keep you on a level playing field throughout the various missions. It's not all just about mindlessly attacking enemies, however, as many of these missions require you to complete different objectives. From collecting specific items to escorting valuable targets, the game constantly throws new things for you to do, which really helps it from becoming stale. For Gundam fans, this one's a done deal, and it serves as one of the quintessential games that's worth your time. But for those of you who may not know the series or have no interest in it, Battle Royale still offers enough that will satisfy casual fans of action combat and is well worth picking up. Deadhead Fred has to be one of the most eccentric games on the PSP that sees you filling the boots of Fred Newman, a private detective who got in too deep and ended up losing his life as well as his head. Thanks to the efforts of a rather crazy scientist, Fred is now being resurrected with the ability to change his head, allowing him to take advantage of different powers. He's now hell-bent on finding those responsible for his demise. For as crazy as the story sounds, it's actually one of the most enjoyable parts of the game, with the witty and entertaining banter between the characters, which is only amplified by the incredible voice acting. Thankfully, the gameplay more than lives up to the lofty expectations set by the story, and sees you making your way through Fred's hometown of Hope Falls and encountering many obstacles that hope to hold you back from enacting revenge. This is where the combat system comes into play, and although it's quite simple, it manages to be effective and gut-wrenching at the same time. You've got a simple 2-button setup that allows you to perform a few combos, but once the enemy is stunned, this is where some of the more gruesome aspects of the gameplay come into play. As I mentioned earlier though, each of Fred's heads give him different powers. There's 8 of them in total, which are all suited to different kinds of situations, from dealing massive amounts of damage to foes with the stone head, or taking on the ability of temporary flight with the corpse head. The best thing about them is that they are not at all trivial, and actually play into many of the game's environmental puzzles, which forces the player to get to grips with the pros and cons of each head as they move forward. Deadhead Fred was a breath of fresh air in an otherwise tiresome genre that was often afraid to try new things, and although it's not perfect, it was certainly a welcome change from what games of a similar nature were offering at the time. This is one game I highly recommend, so if you come across it, it is well worth grabbing. The PSP was a literal powerhouse when it came to JRPGs, with the likes of Crisis Core and Kingdom Hearts making an appearance on the console. It was the perfect handheld for fans of the genre, but more often than not, many of the greatest adventures you could find on the system unfortunately never found their way outside of Japan, and Last Ranker is a prime example. Thanks to a full translation though, it is now easier than ever to try it out and experience what has to be one of the best JRPGs you'll find on the PSP. It sees you taken on the part of Zig, a villager who sets out to visit the big city in the hopes of climbing the ranks in a world where those that do become part of the ruling class. Much like the name suggests, your rank plays a massive part throughout the game, with the main objective being to increase it by encountering those of a similar level and battling them in the hopes of coming out on top. As your rank rises, so does your level, allowing you to wield a myriad of different weapons and execute an ever-increasing amount of abilities. The battle system is incredibly simple and all revolves around the stamina bar, which is depleted when you carry out a move, but slowly replenishes itself over time. This brings a serious amount of strategy to even the most tedious of encounters, as it's easy to catch yourself off guard. Simply spamming your normal attacks won't work, as that's a surefire way to run out of stamina and end up finding yourself in a tight spot. Carefully deciding your plan of attack is the best way to advance, and towards the end of the game, where you'll come up against some of the more daunting enemies, it's essential to have this in the back of your mind, as they can easily destroy you with one decisive hit if you're not careful. Now, the most striking aspect of the game has to be its visuals, that offer up a real sense of scale and adds a severe amount of realism to the world that Last Ranko presents. From quaint little villages to towering cities that run off into the distance, it's an absolute marvel to look at. Overall, if you have the opportunity to give it a try, it's certainly worth considering. Jeanne d'Arc is a strategic RPG developed by Level 5 that focuses on the life of Joan of Arc. It plays a lot like Final Fantasy Tactics, but offers enough variety and unique gameplay that it doesn't just feel like a mere clone, but rather something different that results in one of the more enjoyable SRPGs you'll find on the PSP. Of course, the most important part of any SRPG has to be its gameplay, and this is where the game really comes into its own. Naturally, all of the actions take place on a grid, and it sees each character belonging to one of 3 different affinities, and although it's possible to play whilst ignoring them, each encounter will take far longer as a result. About a dozen or so characters will join up with Jeanne's cause during the duration of the game, with each of them offering their own specific abilities and traits, such as brute force soldiers to archers and magic wielders, which all have a role to play on the battlefield. Like many RPGs, you also have the option to equip these characters with a wide array of items and weaponry that further enhance their proficiency, right up until its end, provides a meaningful sense of progression to the player, and of course another reason to jump back in once you're done and see everything you might have missed the first time around. Visually, the cel-shaded characters and colourful worlds of Jeanne d'Arc are beautiful to say the least. The game is rich and detailed and an absolute delight to look at. On top of this, the frame rate is tight and never buckles under the pressure of the on-screen action, allowing you to fully immerse yourself in the impressive world Level 5 created. If SRPGs are your thing and you've exhausted the other options on the PSP, Jeanne d'Arc will be right up your street. Well, that does it for today's video. Keep an eye out for part 2, as that will be coming up soon, so don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell to get notified about new videos which release every Monday and Thursday. You can follow me on all of the socials which are linked below to stay up to date, and also join my growing community on Discord to meet many like-minded gamers to continue the conversation with. I'd like to give a special shout out to my Patreon supporters Rhino, Skill Jim, Shuden, Richard, Amy, Daniel, Dio, Omar, Strider, Pierre, Carl, Awesome Jacket Dude, Maximus, Scott, Alfred, Ryan, Alex, GameCube Galaxy, Clear Salaryman, and Paddy J for their continued support that helps make these videos possible. If you're interested in joining my Discord or supporting the channel through Patreon, you'll find all of these links down below. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch the video. I'll catch you next time.